Hi, I am Dr. Cynthia Elise Smith, and I'm an anti racism, anti white supremacism educator and essayist. And I specialize in essays and lectures and discussions and presentations with alternative views on race, racist color, racist character, racism, white supremacy, whiteness, blackness, and value. Yes, they're all subjects. I offer deeper, more critical perspectives on these subjects, including the potential implications of wording in the US language lexicon that are not ordinarily considered racialized, because they may be euphemized, dog whistled, or couched within usually benign contexts. Now, I'm not here, like I always say, I'm not here to change your mind, but to make you think critically about the subject matter that I present. And as you're thinking critically, you might just change your mind. But understand this presentation, this lecture, this essay and or discussion is not designed to be comfortable. It is designed to make you think. And before I begin, as I always do, I want to ensure that everyone understands the definitions that I use. And before I begin, I want to give you those three critical thinking tools that I use throughout the presentations. My light bulbs already know, but this is for people who may happen upon this essay for the very first time. I call these tools the three C's of navigating through the language system of racism and white supremacism. And the first one is comprehension. Comprehension is the most important because it is the essence of understanding. Understanding and comprehension are very similar. It's the essence of understanding what you're saying, being told, writing, or reading, or the ability of your mind to form and craft the imagery and concepts from words that are spoken, read, or written. Next is context. Second to comprehension is the ability to understand the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, idea, effect, consequence, or solution, and in terms through which they can be fully identified, comprehended, and assessed, such as value. If you understand value within the context that I present, then you understand that whole concept of how racism and white supremacy is based on the value of humanity, as an example. Next up is connotation. It is the ability of words to summon emotion or an idea or feeling that a word invokes, in addition to how it is spoken literally or written literally or read literally, its primary meaning. Connotation is particularly important because it is the feeling of the words, the reaction associated with a word. How do you feel when certain words are spoken? Somebody call you a hoe. How that make you feel? So understand that it is that part of the words, sentences, and paragraphs from your thoughts that create the drama and the intrigue and cause people to react happily, sadly, kindly, violently, or otherwise. Now, for purposes of this essay, these are the definitions of race, racist color, racist character, racism, white supremacy, whiteness, and value that I'll be using. So when you hear these words, understand the definitions based on what I am giving you as you determine context and you comprehend. Okay? So, first up is race. Race is any one of the groups that humans are often divided into based on physical traits regarded as common among people of shared ancestry. Now, you often hear people say, is race real? No, not really, but for all intents and purposes, it is. It's a paradox. It is and it isn't simultaneously. Race as color. It is color used to distinguish a race of people, such as black and white. Race as character. Race as character is used to distinguish a race of people based on character, the content of their character. Next is racism. And I always say, pay special attention to this because I am going to drill and drill and drill and drill until that light turns on and you understand what racism is, so that you have no doubt whatsoever what racism is. Racism is the systematic subjugation, and do bring your dictionaries and your thesauruses with you whenever you come to class. It is the systematic subjugation within established institutions in the US through structurally designed discrimination and denial of opportunity, equity, equality, and justice built into every single institution in this country to control the formerly enslaved. Make no mistake what it was created to do. The formerly enslaved and their descendants in perpetuity. Remember, these are the same people who thought enslavement would be forever and made enslavement hereditary for Black people. You inherited that station in life, in bondage. So when that ended, they needed to create a system in order to perpetuate that notion, that ideology of white supremacy, that we'll get to that definition, in order to perpetually control the descendants, their descendants as well, after the enslavement ended and the enslaved were emancipated. But do understand that it is not simply prejudice or bias and the associated behaviors. It is not simply prejudice or bias. Pay attention to that word bias and the associated behaviors. Think of it this way. And I often use, this is the example that I use because it to me it is the plainest example that I can give you. Can Black people despise white people? Absolutely, yes, yes, yes. Can Black people hate white people because they are white? Absolutely, yes, yes, yes. But here's the difference. Can Black people as a collective suppress the vote of white people? Can they ban books by white authors simply on the basis of race? Can they change history to sanitize it for the comfort of Black people? Can they deny the very system itself was created in the first place, even in the face of overwhelming generational evidence that exists to this day? And if you can answer yes to that, then Black people can be racist. But the answer is a resounding no, which means that Black people cannot be racist. That is exclusively whiteness at work and using the mechanism of racism as that unbleached description and definition describes. Now, I mentioned white supremacy, and this is what it is. It is the ideology that uses color and whiteness as a value and merit metric, where superiority and goodness align with the color white, and the color black and blackness are aligned as bad or inferior, each having been assigned. Understand that. Nobody was born with that. Those colors were assigned generations ago to skin pigmentation. And we talk about that. I talk about that in various other lectures and essays about, in fact, I have one that discusses when that happened. Next is whiteness. So you have white supremacism and you have whiteness. Now, whiteness is the theory that actually creates the ideology. It sustains well, not sustains it, but it created that ideology, because whiteness is the theory that skin pigment or the assignment of color to imply skin color grants the individual the assignment of the color white to imply skin color grants that individual with certain natural rights and privileges, where the indoctrinated perception is of complete sovereignty over and above anything else on the planet Earth. That is what the theory of whiteness is. So understand, there is a belief, a theory. Next is value. Value is the desirability of a thing, often in respect of some property, such as usefulness or exchangeability, worth, merit, importance, value, as in the value of human beings in this context. Value has an intrinsic association with the terms race, racist color, racist character, racism, and white supremacy, because value is the codifier for those terms, providing context and connotation and leading to better comprehension of each. Now, today's lecture uh, was inspired by a situation that my daughter found herself in. Wasn't a big deal. Of course, she's well fixed in terms of, having a mother like me. She knows how to navigate, and within her own right as well. But it made me want to talk about a subject that I'm frankly sick and tired of. Um, I'm frankly sick and tired of white people using euphemisms to hide, mask, sanitize their the white supremacy in a nutshell. But before I begin, I want to ask you to like and share the video. If you're not a light bulb already, please feel free. I want to thank everyone who brought me to 1,000. I'm over 1,000, not by much, but God knows I am thankful. I actually made 1,000. I lit up with 1,000 light bulbs, and while I'm not monetized as yet, and that isn't necessarily the goal, except that I want to be able to create memberships, but I have to gain watch hours. That's very important. That's my next goal. And I do believe I need about maybe 1,050, something like that, 1,000 or so thousand or so watch hours left in order to put me in a position where I can begin to offer memberships to everyone. My goal is not to monetize for necessarily for monthly income. I'm retired. I'm very comfortable, and I don't do this for money, even though it's okay. Donations are always okay. They're always welcome. Anyway, you can also find me on any one of these platforms. So please feel free to look me up on any one of these platforms and follow. As the whiteboard says, cutting the bull. When implicit bias is used to euphemize white supremacy. Now, I have on the blackboard here, class, I hope you can all see it. I have some things here on the blackboard that I want you to consider in this discussion. One is, what are euphemisms? In my book, White Supremacy and the Post-Racial Colorblind Era, I go into great depth discussing euphemisms and what they are. Let me go to that section just to describe for you what euphemisms are. Hold on one second. Euphemisms. Okay, 4.2. Okay, racial euphemisms, 4.2.1. That is on page 80. Okay. All right. Now, this is what I explain. A euphemism is a mild or indirect word or expression substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt when referring to something unpleasant or embarrassing. So that is what a euphemism is. Now, the next point to consider is the question, what is implicit unconscious bias? Well, unconscious is self-explanatory. It means that the person is unaware of the bias that he or she or they may harbor. Implicit bias means that it is known, it's understood, but it is presented in a suggestive way rather than outright, rather than an overt expression. Now, 3, are the terms implicit and unconscious the same? Hell no. Although, believe it or not, there are those who believe that these terms, these two biases, implicit and unconscious, are the same, which is what I get into in this essay. And finally, number 4, how are these terms represented with regard to race, race as color, race as character, and white supremacy? So I want you to consider all of these things as you listen to the essay entitled Cutting the Bull When Implicit Bias is Used to Euphemize White Supremacy. One other thing before I begin is that it is up on my website for those of you who would like to read the essay for free. Let me see. Here we go. Visit my website. Let me see if I can. Yeah. Visit my website and okay, here we go. Yeah. Visit my website and you can read that as well as my other essays absolutely free, or support me by joining Medium for $5 a month, and you get to read or actually listen. Now they have a voice uh a voice converter that you hit the little megaphone. I'm not megaphone. You hit the little voice. Yeah, I guess that's a megaphone, and it reads it to you, kind of like Audible, but using an automated voice. But you do get to listen to it as opposed to reading it if you prefer auditing as opposed to, I mean, listening to it rather than reading it. So anyway, cutting the bull. When implicit bias is used to euphemize white supremacy. It always gives me pause whenever I come across the terms unconscious bias or implicit bias when it comes to race in general, and specifically racist color and racist character. It is important at the outset to distinguish between the kinds of bias whose origins are benign, like favoring frozen yogurt over gelato, or even the desire to date tall men over short men. Everyone has biases that rest in the recesses of the mind. Some are always present, and others only surface when the subject meets the bias head on. This essay discusses the terms when used to mislead the public into believing racial bias falls within the category of implicit and or unconscious, because these terms are also the go-to explanations for expressions of racial hostility by people identifying as white toward Black people today. As far as I'm concerned, neither implicit bias nor unconscious bias provides an adequate justification for behavior generations old and is consistently reinforced daily through entertainment and political media interpretations. The attempt by psychologists and sociologists to justify racial biases is similar to how eugenics was justified as evolutionary behavior in the past. White supremacism and its associated behaviors are provided equivalents with the more benign types of biases, creating yet another cover, a euphemism that lasted 28 years so far. In fact, in this 21st century, these terms are used interchangeably with prejudice and to describe racism itself. Much too often, anything racial, where the specificity is among the binaries of black and white, superior and inferior, or good and bad, is hidden behind benign illustrations of bias. To provide the necessary magnitude in terms of irrationally based views, gender and sexual representations are often presented as examples instead of race. It is crucial for open, unambiguous dialogue within the context of race and the relationship between white and Black people, because the impression garnered by these terms can be confounding, as is the case with everything concerning the paradox of race, whiteness, and white supremacism. Now, the sciences of psychology and sociology are often the areas of study where the terms unconscious and implicit are interchangeable, a simultaneous equivalency, as though behavior can be unconscious and implied at the same time. Notwithstanding any dichotomy created by these sciences, unconscious actions are impacted by the behavior of people who are not aware of the origins of such behavior. And implied actions occur because while the behavior is known and understood, it is typically covert in its presentation. Either way, supremacist behavior is explained away by couching it inside a brain fog of either complete obliviousness or, if at least aware, kept to themselves and not expressed openly generally because they don't believe the awareness extends to themselves. This is quite disconcerting and another attempt, in my view, to provide mental sanctuary to many white people in need of yet another gentle way to hide the obvious. Are my light bulbs getting it? Are you here today? I'll check you out once I finish the essay. But if you do understand, throw a few light bulbs in. For those who wish to perpetuate the notion of synonymy, meaning whether these two terms, implicit and unconscious, are synonyms, combining two obviously distinct forms of bias can only be described as, for lack of a better cliche, wanting their cake and eating it too. In an article written by Joe Cacaval for the website Applied, titled, "What's the Difference Between Implicit Bias and Unconscious Bias?" Yes, that is something that's open for discussion among scholars. There is no, quote, there is no difference between implicit bias and unconscious bias. They are simply two different terms for the same thing. I want you to listen to this, people. I want you to listen to this, class. Both refer to our tendency to make judgments based on prejudice and assumptions rather than indisputable facts and data. And we're all influenced by them whether we like it or not. They're the result of evolutionary psychology, which has hardwired us to view the world in terms of social categories. End quote. Now I'm going to break it down for you. The first critical piece of information contained in that statement is the implicit discussion of race without interjecting race specifically. Did you notice that, class? Did you notice how he made a comment about um, influenced, whether we like it or not, terms for the same thing? We'd have a tendency to make judgments based on prejudice. And when I talk to you about prejudice later on, you'll understand that this is where he was going. He just wasn't trying to go there directly. So it was implied. So the first piece of critical information contained in that statement was the implication, the implicit discussion of race without interjecting race specifically, using prejudice. The second critical piece is the notion of being hardwired to view the world in terms of social categories. What exactly does the writer mean by social categories, first of all? Why is he resigning himself to the idea that the influences of assumptions due to prejudice are static, as in whether we like it or not, implying a particular permanence to those influences? Who did the hard wiring? Who does the hard wiring today, especially in relation to unconscious or implicit biases centered around race and particularly Black people? Is it evolution? Is it the science of psychology? The writer seems to think it's a combination of both. The idea we are all influenced by biases, whether so called conscious or implicit, as the result of some evolutionary psychology, is a blatant cop out, as though someone, as though somehow evolution created the ideology of superiority and inferiority. Understand that. Let me explain that again. The idea that we are all influenced by biases, whether so-called conscious or implicit, as the result of some evolutionary psychology, is a blatant cop-out, as though somehow evolution created the ideology of superiority and inferiority, and it wasn't unnatural at all, and that we can like it or lump it. That's basically what he was saying. The statement was no more scientific than eugenics was in its time. Quite simply, generations and generations of indoctrination and conditioning into an ideology of superiority of the races, superiority and inferiority of the races, was placed into the collective psyche of whiteness. Remember, what is whiteness? What is whiteness, people? Class? It is the theory that skin pigment or the assignment of the color white to imply skin color grants the individual with certain rights and privileges, the indoctrinated perception being complete sovereignty over and above anything else on the planet Earth. So, what he's trying to say is that, what I'm trying to say is that indoctrination and conditioning by people, not evolution. Okay? So, quite simply, generations and generations of indoctrination and conditioning into an ideology of superiority, that white supremacism, and superiority and inferiority of the races was placed into the collective psyche of whiteness, and created that theory to craft its social categories, because that's where the social categories came from, that, and the thoughts and beliefs that came out of it, not evolutionary psychology. In the writer's statement, one thing that resonated was the tendency to make judgments based on assumptions derived from prejudice instead of relying on indisputable facts and data. Now, I changed the order of his sentence from judgments based on prejudice and assumptions to judgments based on assumptions derived from prejudice. This is because assumption-based prejudice combines both assumptions and prejudice as cause and effect, rather than creating two distinct categories for assumptions and prejudice when making judgments. Frankly, assumptions are not necessarily prejudiced, and prejudice, which, although similar to bias, is more severe, since it can translate into discrimination in the workplace, and prejudice is considered overt and conscious, as you'll hear later. It makes one wonder, since when now did prejudice become synonymous with implicit or unconscious bias? When did prejudiced behavior become unknown to the individual, or at least suggested indirectly, as the writer was trying to defend? Remember now, this writer said there is no difference between implicit and unconscious bias. They're both simply two different terms for the same thing. Both refer to our tendency to make judgments based on what, class? Based on prejudice. And prejudice is overt and outright. Okay, it ain't nothing clandestine or implied or unconscious about prejudice. Okay, not a thing. In a Maryville University blog written in 2021 on the subject of overcoming one's implicit bias, many types of benign implicit biases were discussed in an obvious attempt to disengage from the seriousness of racial bias to those biases engaged in by most people, no matter the race. Two in particular were used to describe unconscious and implicit bias. The first was described in this way, quote, examples of unconscious bias are present throughout our personal and professional lives. In Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking, Malcolm Gladwell notes that roughly 3.9% of adult men are 6 foot 2 inches or taller. Yet among a random sampling of CEOs, he found that nearly a third, or roughly 33.3%, fell into this group. According to Gladwell, this could be linked to an unconscious belief that height correlates with success. This hypothesis is further underscored by a 2020 Chinese study that found that each centimeter in height above average correlated with a 10% to 13% increase in annual earnings, end quote. Okay, I'm going to break it down for you. It is important to note that the example presented lacks a proper explanation of whether the belief was unconscious in regard to its correlation with success and height. Did you get that? What the heck does that have to do with unconscious bias? Simply measuring the responses of CEOs in relation to the percentage of men who are 6'2" or taller does not provide an explanation of whether the CEO's answers were influenced by unconscious bias or not. This is probably why Malcolm Gladwell used the word could to avoid any definitive correlative proof. Using words like could leaves room for the possibility of inaccuracy. I call words like could, may, might, and others softener words. They soften it so that you can sound like you're making a point without actually being definitive about it. I don't know whether I told anybody about this, but in my doctoral program, I always found myself in a position, and then also in my master's program, I found myself in a position where I was told not to be aggressive in my writing, and that I should, which said to me that I could not be definitive. I would need to use more softener words. They didn't call them softener words. I coined them softener words. Like this may be as the result of, as opposed to this is the result of. So he leaves himself open a little room for the possibility of inaccuracy or the probability, which I believe he's probably inaccurate. In addition, a 2020 Chinese study found a direct relationship between height and annual earnings, which adds to the difficulty of explaining whether the bias was truly unconscious or not. It's possible that it was actually implied bias. It could have been implied bias rather than unconscious bias, which is the attempt at combining the two examples of so-called unconscious bias to demonstrate prejudice against people who are shorter. Like, whatever. So which is it? Did the CEOs not know they were biased? Or did they know but decided to keep the knowledge of height and salary increases to themselves, or suggesting it, not openly, maintaining the implication without admitting culpability. Now, in the second example, racial discrimination through overt prejudicial behavior was disguised as implied bias. You ready for this one? Quote, in an example from 2018, two black men walked into a Philadelphia Starbucks to attend a business meeting. The manager asked them to leave and they declined, saying they were waiting for their associate. The manager called the police, who then arrested the men. In interviews after the arrest, the men said they believed the manager had targeted them because of their race. Starbucks responded by holding company-wide training to address implicit bias, to promote conscious inclusion, and to prevent discrimination, end quote. Clearly, the manager was exhibiting prejudicial behavior that could not have possibly been the result of implicit bias, and certainly nothing about her actions was unconscious. Vocabulary.com describes prejudice as a negative attitude towards someone based on race or ethnicity rather than personal experience. Cambridge defines prejudice as an unfair and unreasonable opinion or feeling, especially when formed without enough thought or knowledge. Not having enough thought or not having enough knowledge, or not using much thought before behaving in a particularly racially biased fashion is not unconscious or implicit. Asking the two men to leave was not the result of some unconscious bias coming to the surface suddenly, or a reaction to something suggested indirectly through her mind, since she expressed herself quite openly that day. Was her behavior influenced by evolutionary psychology, whether we like it or not? The question I would ask the owners of Starbucks is why the culture of the establishment, represented by the management, was completely at ease in calling the police on people simply because they were black, and she assumed they were loitering or they just didn't belong. How many people who identify as white sit for hours upon hours taking advantage of the free internet service provided by Starbucks, some not even bothering to purchase a coffee or muffin? Finally, why didn't they address head on white supremacism that spawned her behavior, rather than hiding behind the wall of implication, which provided the option of ideas that, quote, perhaps she was prejudiced, but she didn't know she was, or knew it, but didn't expect it to come out, or was caught completely unaware? Because that's basically what implied, implicit bias would suggest, or unconscious bias would suggest. The phrase implicit bias was coined in 1995 by psychologists Maharazin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald in an article titled Implicit Social Cognition: Attitudes, Self-Esteem, and Stereotypes. It looks like my internet connection is a little low. Put some light bulbs in the chat, those of you who are here, if you can still hear me. If you can still hear me, put some light bulbs in the chat. Okay. Okay, good. Thank you, Ruthless. Hi, baby. Okay. Okay. The phrase implicit bias was coined in 1995 by psychologists Mahazarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald in an article titled Implicit Social Cognition, Attitude, Self-Esteem, and Stereotypes. In it, they contended, now I want you to listen to this. In it, they contended that social behavior often operates as an implicit or unconscious fashion, in an implicit or unconscious fashion. Now, according to Doctors Banaji and Greenwald, social behavior operates unconsciously or implicitly. The use of the word or suggests that neither bias holds the same rationale as most people think, making the equivalency of the two biases questionable, wouldn't you think? How are they the same when it's this or that? Not this and that, not this slash that. However, the statement is implied rather than an open expression of the differences between the two. As psychologists, I believe they intentionally adjusted the terminology of bias to implicit from the unconscious to offer some cognitive representation of cerebral coherence and plausibility, meaning they did it so that they wanted to ensure that it could be understood that it takes some kind of coherence, some kind of understanding and knowledge to be plausible. Even though they opted to retain the term unconscious loosely, in my opinion, they included it in their explanation to allow for conciliation in the arena of psychologists and sociologists who still may want to attribute some explanation of phenomena beyond what the mind openly agrees as the cause for the actualization of biased thoughts of race, color, or character. You got some people who just don't want to let go of that. Oh, I was completely unaware. I did not know I was biased. I did not know I was prejudiced. Got me? Okay. Dr. Banaji, the Richard Clark Cabot Professor of Social Ethics in the Department of Psychology at Harvard. Oh, she's lettered, okay? And considered a pioneer in the study of implicit. She's the seminal pioneer in the study of implicit bias. She spoke about her work on a podcast with an interviewer, Kim Mills, for the American Psychological Association. Her work centers around what she determines to be disparities between conscious expressions of values, attitudes, and beliefs on the one hand, and less conscious, implicit representations of mental content. So it's important to note here that acknowledging being less conscious is not the same as being completely unconscious. Okay. So understand that. Understand that, she's talking about less conscious. And that is not the same as being completely unconscious, which owes more of her work on implications formed by the mind rather than a complete escape from consciousness altogether as an explanation of behavior. Again, it would appear Dr. Banaji is distancing herself from the notion of unconscious and implicit equivalency. In the opening segment of the interview, she vehemently declared, and rightly so, that implicit bias was not a euphemism for racism. Understand that. I want you to hear that because it isn't a euphemism for racism. This was an important declaration since many still attribute implicit bias to racism as though racism is purely an implied interpersonal behavior of love and hate rather than a system. What did we say? What is racism? the systematic subjugation within established institutions in the US through structurally designed discrimination and denial of opportunity, equity, equality, and justice built into every institution in the country. Okay. This was an important declaration since many still attribute implicit bias to racism, as though racism is purely an implied interpersonal behavior of love and hate. See, and you know that whole love and hate thing, we talked about it, that allows them to share that whole idea of being racist with us, rather than a system designed to perpetuate behavior caused by whiteness as what? As sovereign. Caused by the theory of whiteness as sovereign. And we talked about sovereign on another occasion in class. What is sovereign? Power over, the belief of superior, supreme power over everything. Okay. The Starbucks example illustrated how racism was given equivalency with implicit bias by virtue of their response to the racial discrimination vis-a-vis racism in their establishment. Bernanke went on to explain, quote, prejudice to psychologists, and I want you to hear this, thinking caps on, because I'm going to take this apart. Prejudice to psychologists is an explicit conscious aversion or dislike that one person may have toward a group of people. If I were to say to you, I do not think a woman should be teaching at Harvard, that would be an example of something we would call conscious prejudice. What we've studied and what the invention of computers that allowed us to do experiments that would get at other levels of our minds. See, understand, let me just break this up for a minute, because I need for you to understand that this came from a podcast. And this is the transcript of the podcast. So I need for you to imagine this woman speaking like this. This learned, lettered psychologist was speaking like this. Prejudice to psychologists is an explicit conscious aversion or dislike that one person may have towards a group of people. If I were to say to you, I do not think that women should be teaching at Harvard, that would be an example of something we would call, meaning psychologists like her would call, a conscious prejudice. So now she goes on to say, what we've studied and what the invention of computers that allowed us to do experiments that would get at other levels of our minds, what that work revealed, yeah, I found it a little difficult to get with and understand two people. So let me continue. Revealed was that a large number of people in our society have genuinely, honestly come to a point where they believe that they are not biased. And that, I would argue, is true. This is not something they've made up. This is not something they're lying about. They genuinely believe in the ideals of egalitarianism, equal treatment, fair treatment, and they disavow prejudice. They teach their children how not to be prejudiced and so on. And yet, what our evidence showed, now listen carefully, people. What our evidence showed is that those very same people, I would say, people like your listeners, people like myself, we found that we do have what we call implicit levels of bias. It is not at all the same as racism or sexism, but it is indeed evidence of an association in our heads that I would call the roots of prejudice. The hell, the hell did she just say out her mouth? Not racism or sexism, but evidence of an association in our heads that she would call the roots of prejudice. Now, what did she say the prejudice was? Okay, so I'm going to break that down a little bit. Upon reflection, Dr. Benagi's discussion leaves much to unpack. Validity is not gained simply by declaring a belief one way or the other. See, understand that something does not become valid just because you declare you believe it. She was adamant. They really believe it honestly and sincerely. That doesn't mean jack. There are many white people who believe in egalitarianism in the broader sense, sure, but will never give up their perceived sovereignty over everything on the planet. They will never give up their whiteness. They will never give up the benefits associated with having been assigned that color to their skin. It can be agreed that prejudice relative to race as color and character is an overt speculation of people based on the predetermined superior and inferior ideology of whiteness, of superiority, and of the theory of whiteness and the beliefs that spring from them. However, if the example of not liking women teaching at Harvard should be considered a conscious prejudice, why would there be a need for, quote, implicit bias classes at Starbucks for behavior that was obviously conscious prejudice? Because, listen, this woman was like, you can't be here. How is that any different? How is that any different? Arriving at a point or position in life where one believes they are not biased, no matter how genuinely or honestly they come to such conclusions, does not negate the fact that behavior is supposedly hardwired through evolutionary psychology as expressed earlier. I mean, if we're going to believe that, then it needs to be applied. There are just as many white people who honestly and genuinely believe in their superiority over black people and harbor no unconscious or implicit bias, since their bias is conscious. And they teach their children as well. Moreover, acknowledging that at least some level of bias is the root of prejudice, after defining prejudice and then stating the prejudice isn't about race or sex, and allowing at the same time for the belief that no biases exist, is, in my view, pervasive doublespeak, making the cake and eat it too attitudes of many who identify as white, and Dr. Benaji suspect in that statement. The discussion of implicit bias and the examples used throughout the interview were carefully arranged. Trust me, carefully arranged to dismiss outright issues of racial bias, but included almost all conceivable LGBTQIA and sex or gender based perceived implicit biases when discussing the less benign and the more damaging forms of these biases. In fact, The only time Black people were mentioned in her discussion at all was when Dr. Bernanke was asked where biases come from and how biases are formed and learned. Quote, "You're right to use the word learn because we're not born knowing African Americans are bad and white people or European Americans are good. We're not born into the world believing men should be going to work and women should be at home. So learning is what happens. But I would be remiss, I think, not to speak a little bit about what we mean here by learning. What we mean here by learning is something that happens extremely fast, quite early in life, and then progresses. And that comes not just from the social environment, but by the structure and architecture of our minds, the way our brain got built over a period of evolutionary history. Yep. Yeah, she went there. She went there. Mm, she tried it. I read the transcript and then I listened to that portion of the podcast a few times. I tried to read through her inflection to come to some semblance of connotative understanding. See, because the literal understanding wasn't understanding. It wasn't comprehending. So I tried to find some semblance of connotative understanding. How was this making me feel? Of her example using the binary of good and bad from the statement, we are not born knowing African Americans are bad. She was evidently attempting to simultaneously qualify that the particular belief wasn't born knowledge, but without providing validation for the value of the statement as wrong on its face. By using the term knowing and not immediately disavowing the statement as false. Remember now, she just said basically, we're not born knowing. We're not born knowing. I mean, she could have said we're not born thinking erroneously that African Americans are bad. We're not born knowing, which of course is wrong. But, understand what she said. She was trying to simultaneously qualify that particular belief wasn't born knowledge, of course, but without providing the validation for the value of the statement is wrong on its face by using the term knowing and not immediately disavowing the statement as false. She subsequently justified the notion that perhaps white people who thought that way probably discovered that Black people were bad on their own without any intervention from parents and their social environments. She went on to state that since they weren't born knowing already, learning was extremely fast and quite early in life, which is divergent from her very next statement of how our brains got over a period of evolutionary history, which I would conclude is a slow process and which makes no sense at all. Which is it? Immediately after birth, progressing early in life, or the slow process of evolutionary history on our building brains? Nevertheless, she was offering cover. She was providing cover for white people who might have learned from their parents and the social environment. Her statements were undoubtedly targeted at an audience she believed was at least predominantly white, and again presented as a cake and eat it too attitude. I want my cake and eat it too. I want it to have been a slow process and an extremely fast process. I want us to be completely unaware, but no. Of course, the statement is a given for those who know people are not bad for being born black. I mean, that was an understatement. However, what she presented in that statement, nonetheless, was an open reflection of learned white supremacism, akin to, and this is basically, she didn't say this, I'm saying this, but this is basically what she was trying to say. We believe it, but we weren't born like that. Or we learned it, we forgot it, and it isn't social conditioning, but just something in our minds through evolution that many of us truly and honestly believe we forgot or just unaware of, or even though we admit we are at least a little biased. The need to qualify quickly what she meant by learning was palpable. Imagine she's just talking that, and then all of a sudden she caught herself. We're not born knowing black people are bad. And she's like, oh, I need to qualify that. I need to step back a little bit and explain what I mean by learning. See, because, you know, it was almost as though she immediately caught her voice trapped in a statement from her mouth she knew she had just put her foot into. If prejudice to psychologists is an explicit and conscious aversion or dislike that one person may have towards groups of people, these are her words, for example, white people against black people, then how does one reconcile learning about supremacism and whiteness, then coming to a point where they believe they are not biased, despite simultaneously owning being biased? Oh, we're just a we we're just a little biased, but we don't know it. Since when, excuse me, since when is the validity for any individual gained by merely believing oneself is not prejudiced or biased, especially when it is admitted that the behavior is learned? By her explanation, she admits that what the evidence showed was that now this is her quote, she admits that what the evidence showed was, quote, that those very same people, I would say, people like your listeners, people like myself, we found that we do have what we call implicit levels of bias. So she's going to admit that the evidence showed that they are biased, but she's going to make it implicit, suggestible, and levels. So now she's providing levels of this bias. Here, implicit levels of bias attempt to sanitize prejudice by placing it in the background of conscious thought and giving respite for average white people who harbor such prejudices as simply something to which not much thought is giving. Here, implicit levels of bias attempt to sanitize prejudice by placing it in the background of conscious thought and giving respite for average white people who harbor such prejudices, but who simply want to treat it as something, as simply not something to which much thought is given. If unconscious bias is a thing, it must mean the learning leaves the conscious state to live dormant in the unconscious until such time a behavioral action must be taken according to the beliefs from which the learning sprung. She was careful not to indict the social environment, instead, placing the blame on the structure of our minds rather than the obvious generational animosity of white people toward black people. And when that animosity became an ideology and a system to perpetuate it. The statement of the way our brains were built, attributing it to evolutionary history, was, in my view, tantamount to eugenic pseudoscience and was gibberish, unbecoming someone of her achievements in psychology. Implicit or unconscious bias, no matter which way it is used, may not be a euphemism for racism. But guess what, people? Guess what, class? It is certainly a euphemism for white supremacism, since the ideology is what causes the behavior. You getting me? It's a euphemism for white supremacism, since the ideology is what gives rise to the behavior, which in turn grinds the mechanisms of systemic institutional racism. Stepping all over themselves, equivocating over terms to hide the obvious, sanitizing euphemisms like implicit bias and using it to disguise supremacist thought on account of race, racist color, racist character, and the value of humans on account of these. Rather than facing the learned, indoctrinated, and conditioned belief in white supremacism, I am struck by the ease at which implicit biases invariably enter into the discussion of race as color and character and racism, almost as though implicit bias is joined at the hip, while simultaneously hiding in plain implied sight. The sad part that is there is a paltry amount of scholarly discussion of the black white binary of implicit biases and prejudice, specifically on that basis. When one considers Starbucks' reaction and response to the blatant racial discrimination against young black men waiting for their meeting partner to arrive as implicit bias, and then fostering training on it rather than dealing with the pervasiveness of white supremacism, one must conclude that implicit bias is being used interchangeably with racially discriminatory behavior, known and explicit in its prejudice, and that implicit bias as a term is nothing more than another attempt at disinfecting white supremacism and racism by making it appear animosity occurs without any prior awareness. It's time to cut through the bull and deal openly with the ideology that placed the United States and indeed the world where it is today. And that brings me to the end of this lecture. I hope you got some benefit from it. I hope it gave you an understanding about what euphemisms are, what implicit conscious and unconscious bias are as terms. Um, I hope that you gained an understanding about the terms, whether they are the same or not. And I hope that you got an understanding of how these terms are represented with regard to race, racist color, character, and white supremacy. I hope you were able to get something from it in that way. Now, let me take a look at people who came to class today. Oh, hi, Latrice. Hi. Glad to see you. Glad to see you, Melanated Drip. And of course, Ruthless, my mod. I have a mod, y'all. my day ones, my day ones. Ruthless and Latrice. Latrice, you know you a day oneer. Regina Snow. Hi, Regina. Hi, Regina. Good to see you. Good to see you. I'm very happy that you all came to class. Do share, do like, and do ask your friends and your relatives to subscribe to the channel because it is my desire to educate. And before I'm through, everybody is going to understand how these words are used. They're going to understand how they take these words, such as implicit bias, and apply it to themselves to hide the belief in white supremacy and to make that whole concept of white supremacy a little more palatable, a little more comfortable. White people will say to you, I do have implicit bias. I do have some bias. I do have implicit biases. I do have some unconscious biases, but they're unconscious. I have them, but I don't know I have them. And how all of that can be reconciled to me is just enormously disconcerting. Enormously disconcerting. So, as is the case with all my classes, it's time to say goodbye. I don't want to stay in the class and keep you any longer than is necessary, especially since this was over an hour. Thank you so much for coming. Replay gang, don't forget to hit the like. And I'm going to say goodbye now. And just be on the lookout. Be on the lookout for another one of my essays. As you know, I definitely have been inspired of late. I've been doing more writing now than I really have done in long time. So, you know what I do want to know? Does anybody want to come up and discuss this before I go? If you do, just say yes in the chat if you want to. If not, I will bid you a fond farewell. I did that last time, and Fuchil, my buddy Fuchil, came up, but I was already saying goodbye, and so I missed him, and that made me sad because I do encourage everybody to become a part and participate. You don't have to feel insecure. You don't have to feel like I don't want you to. I want you to feel comfortable. This is a good space. Trust me, this is a very good space. I don't want you to feel like any question that you ask may not be a good one. There are no really stupid questions. People say that's a dumb question. No, no, not really. It's a question nonetheless. It's a question. So if nobody has any questions or there's no discussion, oh wait, I forgot to throw the. Jeez, I'm going to put the link in the chat. I didn't get a yes or anything, but that's okay. I'm gonna throw this link in the chat for a second, and if anybody, I'll wait for a few minutes to see if anybody would like to come up and discuss with me. Is Foo in here? And Foo's here? Wait, Baby Shay. Did I say Baby Shay? I said Regina. I didn't see Baby Shay. Hi, Baby Shay. And Fuchil. Fuchil, you said yes. I put the link in the chat. You want to come up? Come on up. I put the link in the chat. There he is. There's Fu. Oh, hey, buddy. Hold on 1 second. Let me. Hey, Fu. How
Hey,
you
Dr.
doing?
Cindy, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm so glad to see you. I hadn't seen you in a while. I didn't. I was hoping I didn't run you away that last time you were up here.
Oh nah.
We were talking. Yeah, it's good to see you. Good to hear you, rather. So,
Yeah,
what did
you
you?
got you had
Huh?
a great class today. I just wanted to tell you that.
Oh, thank you, Fu.
And
Thank
some of the
you.
stuff,
Thank you.
some of
I
the
appreciate.
some of the things you're saying, I can identify with. You were saying that the
In what way,
racism
Fu?
is.
I can't hear you. You might be breaking up. I can't hear you,
Can you
Fu.
hear me now? Can you hear me
Yeah.
now? Oh
Yes, I
yeah.
can.
Okay. Yeah, you were saying structurally designed discrimination. I never heard
Uh huh.
anybody put it like that, but it's true.
That's exactly what it is. And yeah, that's what it is. See, and it's been made. It's been retooled. It's been spun. It's been sanitized. It's been made to in such a way. It's been changed in such a way to um and into something just interpersonal, as in loving someone or hating someone because of their color, so that black people can be the same way. You could be racist now. Why? Because according to the way that it is defined by today, um, anybody can be racist because it just means somebody hates another person on because they're black or white. I mean, because they're black or white. The difference is that, and that's why I gave that difference, that example of, if you can honestly say that black people can suppress the vote, we can um ban books, we can sanitize history, we can do all that, then we can be racist. But if we
Hmm.
can't do all that, we can certainly not be racist, because
Right.
racism is what it is. It is, and I'm going to pop that up there, that definition up there once again, because I was long. If I can get everybody to understand what racism actually is, here it is. It is the systematic subjugation within established institutions through structurally designed. So if you are being denied opportunity or discriminated against in terms of opportunity, equity, equality, and justice, then being you are in, somebody is being racist toward you. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah, the reason I hit the link, I wanted to share something with you.
Yeah. Go
Uh
ahead.
when I was in the kindergarten, the school I was attending, I was the only black student in the class. So we were about to have recess or whatever. So, during recess you play. So this little white guy, little Italian guy gonna say to me, "You gotta be the monster because you're black." Can you believe that?
You got to be the what?
The
Say it again.
monster. He told me I had to be
The
the monster because I'm black in the
Oh, that's
kindergarten.
horrible. Oh my God.
So as long as I live, I'll never
How
forget
did that?
that.
How did that make you? How did that make you feel?
Well, as a kid, I really didn't process it. I just was, I remember like looking down and feeling like, oh, wow, but I didn't
Yeah, you
pro.
had feelings about it.
Yeah,
It
I
was
didn't pro.
difficult to process it in terms of how you understand it today.
Right at that
Yeah.
age because, but that was my one of my
Yeah.
first encounters with something like that. So that had to be taught to him. The person that said that to me, he learned that in his household.
Hmm. Certainly that, and his social environment. Yes, absolutely, absolutely,
Yep.
absolutely. And what they would probably say to that is, uh, that person had implicit bias,
Hmm.
which you and I both know it was more overt and conscious. Was nothing implicit about that.
Right. Yeah. So I ain't gonna hold you up. I just wanted to share that with the class and just let you know. Today's class was awesome. And
Oh, thank you, Fu. Thank you, Fu. Thank you. I'll be doing some more. I'm chock full of ideas here now. So
yeah,
I can teach, so I can educate everybody about this stuff. Yeah, it's important. It's
yeah, it
important.
is because we have to be reminded because some people act like it's not happening. As
Yeah,
long as
you
they got
got
a
that too.
job and they got their little, hey, whatever. So yeah, we got
Uh-huh.
to be reminded
No,
what's going on.
yeah, I mean it's not as though you really have to walk around with this knowledge uh on your hip and walk around with a chip on your shoulder. This education is so that you can navigate through the muck and the mire of the system of racism and be able to understand the language of the racialized language in the US, because not a lot of, and I use that example of, if you're in a foreign country and you don't understand the language, you can't really do much until
No, you
you
can't.
begin to understand the language and the customs. So I'm here to educate people so that they will understand the language of racism and white supremacy. And when you hear things like implicit bias, you know what it really is. You'll know what it really is. It is an attempt to sanitize what is really going on, white supremacy.
Right, right.
So thank you for coming up, Fu. I appreciate you. I thank you so much. And
You got it
be on the
anytime.
okay. Be on the lookout for the next one, because I'm going to be sitting at this desk the rest of this afternoon. I'm
Okay.
going to be sitting at this desk the next free writing so I can come up with something else. Okay, and
All right, Doctor.
do share, and
I
do
will.
share it with people that will benefit from it.
I will, and you enjoy the
Okay.
rest of your day.
Thank you, Fu. You too.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Bye bye. All right, guys. If nobody else is interested in coming up, I thank you, Fu. I see here that we have someone called Welfare Office who gave me a thumbs down. Well, that's your prerogative. I hope that you actually watched the entire lecture before you put your thumbs down. All righty. I am going to say bye bye to you all now. Until the next time, take care now.